Right. Hello, everybody. We'll let everyone file into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator here. And tonight, we're very happy to be hosting the launch for Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear by Matthew Salesis. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen throughout the event, and Matthew will take them at the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and I'll repost it here. Matthew will be in conversation with Cathy Parkong, and joining them as host will be his editor at Little A, Hafizah Jeter. Let me introduce Cathy and Matthew now. Cathy Parkong is the author of Minor Feelings, Engine Empire, Dance Dance Revolution, chosen by Adrienne Rich for the Barnard Women's Poets Prize, and Translating Maum. Hong is the recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Her poems have been published in Poetry, A Public Space, Paris Review, McSweeney's, Baffler, Yale Review, The Nation, and other journals. She is the poetry editor of the New Republic and is a professor at Rutgers Newark University. Matthew Salesis is the author of The 100-Year Flood, an Amazon bestseller and best book of September, an Adoptive Family's best book of 2015, a Million Most Anticipated of 2015, and a best book of the season at BuzzFeed, Refiner 29, and Gawker, among others. He is also the author of I'm Not Saying, I'm Just Saying, and the nonfiction work Different Racisms on Stereotypes, the Individual, and Asian American Masculinity. Adopted from Korea at age 2, Matthew was named by BuzzFeed in 2015 as one of 32 essential Asian American writers. I'll hand it over now.
Great, thank you. Thank you to everyone who is joining us from all around as we kick off Matt's novel, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear. So to start off, I've asked both Matt and Cathy to share quick readings from both of their books. Cathy's memoir came out in this summer, right?
It came out in February.
In February, right.
Yeah.
And so after they share some of their work, we'll have a conversation. Then Matthew will close us out on one more reading from his book, and then we'll have audience Q&A. That's a wrap. So thank you everyone for joining us. All right, Matt, take this way.
All right, here's the book. I'm going to read just from the very beginning of the book. So actually, it starts with a list of disappearances, but I'm going to skip that and go to the first chapter, which is called Disappearing. And the first section is called Earthquake. One night, my girlfriend asked what was wrong with me, and I couldn't explain. We lay on my black sheets between my blank white walls on the bed that was the room's only furniture. We had bared ourselves. We had a connection when we were naked. But Sandra wanted more than full exposure. It was 3 a.m. after her late shift waiting tables at the cave, and she smelled like fry oil and strangers, and still she talked. Who was I to prefer silence? I told her how I blacked out as I watched the news, ate my microwave dinner, wrote how I woke to find my status update a string of G's with no likes, nothing to account for the time between. It's not just loneliness, I said. I'm pretty sure I'm disappearing. People walk straight into me on the street. When I'm alone in a bathroom with 10 urinals, some white guy will come in and pee right next to me. She twitched her mouth from side to side. This was a habit I envied. She was always doing things equally on either side of her body. When her lips parted, the smack echoed off the empty walls. How long you been feeling like this? She asked, like you're disappearing. I couldn't tell whether she was being sarcastic. Well, these were the facts. My cat was dead. My wife and daughter had left me. At some point in the last 3 years, I'd stopped going out or having friends. After the divorce, I kept the walls blank because the echo was a kind of company. Just to clarify, sorry, that's my daughter. Just to clarify, Sandra said, you felt like disappearing the whole time you've been with me? Just to clarify, I said, what I mean is you're all I have left. Maybe you're the only reason I'm still here. I felt quite smart about this line. Try again, she said. Above us, the popcorn ceiling seemed about to shed its puffs. Okay, today, I said, I went to the butcher shop for bulgogi. I stood in line thinking about how to tell the guy to slice it, and he served everyone else inside, and then every new person who came in. He didn't even look at me. Sandra held her finger in front of me, showing off a new burn on her fingertip. She must have gotten it at work that day. The ceiling blurred in the background. Tonight, she said, one white boy pinched my ass and another tried to tuck his tip under my apron string. I would settle for no bulgogi. The room spun. After a while, I said, my daughter walked into the shop with her mom. They didn't see me either. I'm trying to tell you something, she said. All around us rose the smell of raw beef, the sound of chopping and flirting. A butcher shop was a place of zero subtlety. And then there was my daughter with her lips purple and her hair spiked, and black leggings and silver boots and a camo t-shirt, like this was normal. Sandra sighed. You're in a rough patch, she said cruelly. You'll get out of it. I could tell she wanted to say something more. When she turned her head away, I thought, I had to look on the bright side. After all, in the scheme of things, disappearance was literally no thing, nothing. I was 36 and I was dating and my body still functioned, even if my left foot was slightly bigger than my right. I could afford $1,600 a month to rent the first floor of a duplex in a white Boston suburb. It could be worse, etc. Plus, I added, my agent called. She couldn't sell my novel. Plus, my savings are almost gone. You were right, I shouldn't have quit my job. Sandra sat up and let her hair down over her face like a ghost. Boo, she said. Don't try to blame me. You're depressed. Why were other people always telling me what I was? Anyway, she waved her hands in my face. Did you forget I went to City Hall today to change my name? I want you to say my name correctly when we're having sex. She had my full apprehension now. I'm done answering to two masters, she said. Languages. I had known of her plan to take one official name instead of one English name and one Korean. I had just lost track of what day today was. Yumi? I said. Yumi brushed back her hair and the ghost shifted to her eyes. Do you feel like a single person now? I asked. I never felt like two people, Yumi said. It was only other people who acted like I was. I wondered whether what was wrong with me was that I was other people. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Cathy?
Thank you, Matt, for that reading. If you guys haven't, people who are in the audience, if they haven't bought Matt's book, I strongly recommend it. It's quite a wild and moving ride. So I'm just going to read, let's say, I'm just going to read a paragraph from the beginning of this essay called Bad English, which starts with my obsession with Hello Kitty stationery. So it's called Bad English. I had a special, almost erotic relationship with my stationery when I was young. I collected stationery items the way other kids collect dolls or action figures. Really, I must buy a pencil, Virginia Woolf said, without warning before rushing out the door to begin her peregrination through the wintry streets of London. I would have related to her urgency. I too felt passionately for the lead pencil as long as it was a thin lavender mechanical pencil with a Hello Kitty bauble clasped to the tip with a delicate silver chain. And erasers too, scented raspberry or vanilla, molded into plump pastel wall-eyed Sanrio critters. I adored my erasers so much to bite their heads off. I was careful at first, gently brushing the bobbed feet against my notebook. But once my eraser was spoiled with graphite, I ruthlessly rubbed away my errors until all that remained was a gray, dusty nub of face with one sad punctuation of an eye. For some reason, I was a target in church camp, where the Korean girls my age ostracized me out of their room, claiming all the beds, saying they were taken even if they were not. So I was forced to bunk with the younger girls in the next room. One early morning, I was betrayed by my beloved stationery. I opened a kitty diary, which I'd left unlocked, and saw that someone had inscribed on the first page in neat cursive that must have been written with a mechanical pencil, "Cathy, go home." Thank you.
Thank you both. I feel like the one bad thing about Zoom is you can't hear people clap for you. So my single clap will have to be enough. Thank you. So, you know, I don't think it's possible to start any conversation without acknowledging the pandemic. So I'm just curious, you know, it's a hell of a time to be Black and brown in America. So how is your pandemic going, and how is this like impacting your writing process?
I don't know who goes first.
You do it.
Matt, you're using a
Okay. Man, I've kind of had this confluence of the pandemic and also now the storm that blew through Iowa. I'm in a hotel right now, and it's the first time my kids and I have broken quarantine since March. You know, we like even didn't let friends come over to our house, and now we are in this hotel where nobody is wearing a mask because it's the middle of Iowa, I guess. But we have no power at home and no food, I guess, no food that's not going to spoil. Yeah, so we had to come here. Also, I wanted to do this event. So it's been interesting, though. I think it was, I preferred isolating actually to being out amongst the different ways that people weather the pandemic / don't give a fuck.
I am not in Iowa. I was I was in Brooklyn for a while, like you, Hafizah. I live in Brooklyn, and you know, and it was like, I'm in a 2-bedroom apartment with my husband and my daughter, and we were homeschooling her, and I felt like I was, and it wasn't just like I was quarantined in our apartment. I felt like I was quarantined in my bedroom because for any kind of teaching, you know, my book came out, Zoom events, you know, or any kind of I wasn't writing at all, or just, you know, email, administrative work, all of that was just done. Some freelance writing too, was on my bed in my bedroom, you know, and I was just, you know, I felt like I was going crazy. Then we got like a little desk in the corner of the bedroom that helped. So that was, it's been, you know, it's been really intense, I think, being in New York, and I didn't realize how intense it was until I actually left. I was lucky, family and I were lucky to leave. We've been in Southern Vermont actually for the last month. We'll be here for a couple more weeks. We just rented a place because we wanted space. For my daughter to run around, and that's been great. You know, that's just, it's been a real relief to escape New York for a little bit before I return. But I also feel this compulsion. You know, I know people who have the privilege to escape permanently, who are escaping permanently. But I also, I feel this compulsion to return. I don't know, though I'm
Oh, no.
I think she froze.
much worse the pandemic is going to get, and how we're ill prepared for it, and the elections and school, all of that, you know. And there's kind of like, it's sort of a metaphorical tornado at, I feel like is awaiting. I mean,
It's a real one for Matt.
it's intense right now, and I'm just wondering how much more intense is it going to be. So I don't know. I'm just bracing myself. I've been getting a little writing done. I was supposed to do. I had this book project where I was going to do a bunch of interviews, but I can't do that. So I've been doing some Zoom interviews here and there, which has had some mixed results. But you know, we've been good. I feel like I've been lucky in a lot of ways. But you know, compared to what other people are doing, but I'm going through. But you know, just trooping. What's the word? Being troopers, I guess.
Yeah, completely.
Mhm.
Well, you know, if we think of a time long ago called Before the Pandemic, I'm curious for both of your books, if you could kind of like talk about like the process of writing them, especially since they both offer such, you know, different takes on approaching the personal. You know, Cathy, you wrote a memoir, and you've also written 3 books of poetry. And Matt, like, you literally wrote a doppelganger, so we're not even sure if this is actually you with us right now.
Mhm.
So, you know, if you could both like talk about the writing process.
Sure. I started this book after my daughter was born, my first child. I have 2 now.
Mhm.
Um, and it felt like entering another world. I mean, I can remember standing at the window um, in Mount Auburn Hospital, looking down at the sidewalk along the river and seeing people walk along like minutes, you know, a few minutes after the birth, and thinking like, what? They're just like walking and like living their regular life. How is that possible? Like, don't they know? Don't they know that the world has changed? Um, and I felt at first like this incredible joy, and then very soon afterwards, like just like only intense fear for months. Then a lot of it was adoption related, but there was, you know, I just kind of had this feeling that I was going to screw my kids up, or even like inherited trauma was going to screw them up, and I wouldn't even like know it until they were much older. And so that too felt like this kind of, right, like we were living in like multiple times or multiple lives at once. And I started a book kind of just to stay sane, uh, but also with this idea that I would write like a murder mystery bestseller, which then I made everything literary and ruined it all. Um, but that's, I think, where it came out of, all these doppelgangers.
Love that.
It's hard to remember before the pandemic what was going on within it.
Totally.
I think I mean, not elements, but it's also a collection. It's critical, you know. It's a combination of, uh, I guess you could call it cultural criticism and history and memoir. So it's, you know, and I did not intend it to be a memoir when I first began writing it. But I do think there's a lot of, you know, I think like Matt, you and I have very different approaches, but I think there at core there were definitely similarities, like where you were dealing with invisibility and in your book, and I was dealing with, I was writing about Asian American invisibility too, but like for you, it's like weird Lynchian world of doppelgangers and the sort of its fears of disappearing. Whereas, and I think but I think we were going from the same angle where we're dealing with invisibility and sort of the internalized, just sort of the interior consciousness of what it means to be invisible. And for you, it was more externalized as sort of the surreal tale of Matt Chung Kim Matt Salesses, whereas my book, it was more critical essays about race relations. And the book began actually as, it wasn't even supposed, like the subtitle and marketing came much later, like through the editing process, where my One World editor, Victory Matsui, was like, you need to have Asian American in there. And I was like, well, I don't know. That's really kind of putting a book in a box now, isn't it? I realized that it was very important to do that. But in the beginning, I was like, I wanted more to write about. It was more about race and art and politics. It was just much broader. And it was much more, and the reason why it was actually much more critical. It was more a book of critical essays. And as I continued writing it, it just became much more personal. Like I noticed that as I was revising it, there was more of the first person in there. And then like even especially when I was editing it, like Victory would say, you need more of yourself in there. You need to be more vulnerable. And that, that was very difficult. And it was like, the book, I would say, was a journey making myself more vulnerable for people to kind of not just think through my arguments, but also feel through my arguments. And that was why I had the more memoristic elements in there, which was very difficult for me because I don't normally write personally, but I thought it was necessary because if you're going to write about the condition of invisibility as an Asian American, you have to really kind of, for people to kind of really feel it, you have to really write about, really embody that,
You can't be invisible.
Huh? Yeah.
You can't be invisible, yeah.
You can't be invisible. You have to kind of almost embody every molecule in your body to be like, this is not, I'm invisible, but let me show you how each molecule must look like to, to make yourself. It's not even making yourself visible. I just feel like there's so many like not dumb, but like really kind of truisms about race, like, oh, being invisible or hypervisible or, or being misrepresented or having your voice silenced and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, how do you project that so that people, so people can feel it in a new way? I mean, it's like that Audre Lorde quote, right? There are no new ideas. The only
ways of making them felt.
Just
new ways of making them felt. Yeah, I love that.
And it's the same thing with a lot of these like racial questions. It's like a lot of times it's not exactly new, but that you have to find new ways to make them felt. And I think your book also, Matt, like what you're trying to do with the surrealism is one, kind of way to look at it that's different, right?
Yeah, Cathy, I thought you wrote about everything so clearly while I was trying to like screw everything up. But I was thinking about those similar things and partly why there are so many Matts in the book is I thought too, right? Like it's personal. On some level it's personal, or on like, on the deepest level for me writing the book, it's personal. And I wanted to have a similar thing, like to show that I had skin in the game, pretty literally. And that's where all the Matts came from, probably. Just trying to like make it, put it out there on the surface and not try to hide it.
Yeah, I think like to stay in this kind of like line of conversation, like we're in a time of like such high anti-Asian and anti-Asian American sentiment. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you grapple with writing about like, your identity and your experiences, especially when like these identities and experiences are used to paint a picture of America only when it's politically useful, either to monetize it or to vilify it, but otherwise it's not treated as like an essential part of the American story. So I'm wondering like how do you like navigate that challenge as you write? Do you just like kind of like block it out? Because like, can you ever kind of like separate your double consciousness away as you write?
I think we're just writing into that, right, Kev? I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't speak for both of us, But yeah, I think, you know, I'm working on a book now, or I guess it's done, but it comes out in January, called Craft in the Real World, and the basic premise is just that, right? Like you can't isolate from it. Um, Whether you're trying to or not, the book is going to come out in the world that we live in. Um, and so I think you have to kind of address that.
Mhm. I don't know. I mean, I think that I used to be much more cynical, where I thought that people, racial stories about race were very much publishers treated as a niche market, and that, when headlines about race came up, it was always as a scandal, as Claudia Rankin said, and then it just sort of disappears, and people don't have the sustained attention span for it. But I think it's different this time. I do think that because of, the Black Lives Matter protests, obviously, and Trump and everything, I think there's a real sea change happening, and there's a real, people are really reevaluating what American literature is. And it feels deeper than it has in the past, where people are experience as white and male. And it sees like people are really giving the true respect and attention from BIPOC writers. I just read, I'm reading Raven Leilani's Luster, which is amazing, or like Rick Barrett's Galleons, which is a collection of poems, which is fantastic. And I think, or Girl, Woman, Other. And these are the books that I think will last and will become American literature. I do think it's evolving and it's going to be a permanent change. And I haven't said that before, I'm saying, but I do feel that way now. I do think so with Asian American literature too. There's a lot of really exciting voices that has come out this year and previous years. And I do hope that the anti-Asian has been happening. It's been happening all the time. I've been getting this question all the time, like, did you realize your book was going to be so timely because of the anti-Asian racism? And I'm like, well, yes, I didn't know, no, but yes and no. I mean, like, first of all, for us to have a target on our backs, that was different than previous, than say someone who's a young Black man who has a target on his back. We haven't really experienced that kind of racism. However, the yellow peril, the yellow peril, the foreigner, all of that was always there. That was always under the surface. It was always, it's like the fact that it came out so quickly was just meant that people were thinking it. They were just too distracted with other problems to call, someone a chink, but it was always under the surface. But I think but there were a lot of Asian Americans that I knew of, for instance, who didn't really believe that they were part of the race conversation on America and race, and now they do. And I'm seeing a lot of activism, a lot of allyship from Asian Americans, a lot of Asian Americans coming out there for BLM, and a lot of Asian Americans who are anti-capitalist, and that's very exciting. And I hope it continues. I hope it grows.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really do think writers, we can probably save this whole planet. The writers of color, most likely, will be the ones. Yeah, I think like Alicia Garza talks about how when the Black Lives Matter founder, that when this moment, when we get to moments like this of just the height of racism, that it's important to remember that means our resistance has been working, that that means we're actually gaining ground, and that's this resistance is when it just surges to the all-time high. Plus,
Mhm.
we have the unprecedented Trump, you know? So, like, that
Yeah.
adds a whole, like, new level of absurdity.
Yeah.
You know, in line with that, you know, I'm wondering, like, we're in an era of like alternative facts and like what is the truth and fake news, and I'm wondering, like, how do you both navigate the truth, like, you know, in fiction and nonfiction and poetry? Because like I think that, you know, before Trump, we all, as writers, we all kind of talked about how like truth was a sliding scale and like how the fiction can sometimes be more true, but like this has changed, like this has made us realize that like there are parameters. You know, so I'd love to hear how you two navigate that.
When I started writing nonfiction, um, I had a professor say, like assign something, and an essay, and she said you couldn't even like include dialogue unless it was exactly word for word what had happened. Um, and so I've kind of always gone along with that, I guess. I mean, I think the same things, right? We had that whole movement where certain writers, so they could do whatever they wanted in nonfiction. Um, and yeah, like, I mean, the rhetoric has always been there, I think, and now we're just kind of seeing it on a larger scale where people are kind of utilizing it for political gain in a way that they always have, but we haven't like kind of called as much attention to maybe. Um, so I don't know if I have forgotten the questions. um, how do we navigate the nonfiction stuff? Is that right?
Or
I'm
just
more
like
into the fiction. I like the idea of fiction as something that you can't do in the real world. Like
yeah, like what's your relationship to
ideally,
truth and fiction?
yeah. I'm not a big like straight domestic realism fan because I have a life in the real world already, and I wanted to see like what I can do as a person in this world, um, that's different from like what you can do in fiction.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that, you know, it's funny that you say that. I think when I was coming of age, you know, as a grad student, like in the early aughts, mid aughts, or even up to like during Obama's time period, there was like, you know, there was a lot of pomo fiction and poetry, and a lot of people who are like, oh, what is, you know, to bring, you know, to like raise the question of truth in art making seemed was almost embarrassing in
Yeah.
these very white kind of institutions. And that has completely changed, right? We've done a 180, and now like people, like when I was writing, people weren't quoting Audrey Rich and Audre Lorde and Baldwin. You know, well, no, people were always quoting Baldwin, but like Audrey Rich, for instance, you know, in the same way that they are now. Um, and yeah, I think um, there is a real kind of pressing urgency to speak truths as writers and artists. And I felt that way too. I mean, I started this book actually in 2000, before Trump's election. Around, I started thinking about it. I mean, really, I started thinking about it in 2011, but didn't really start writing it until 2014 or 2015. And I think the way I dealt with truth was, unfortunately, I was writing, not writing poetry, but turning to nonfiction. Like I was just sick of the bullshit. I was just sick. I was just like, I was always thinking that this country will catch up to the complicated racial reality that I know and that I have lived. And it just never did, at least in terms of media and people's presumptions about me and so forth. And I think a lot of Americans are really ignorant about Asian Americans. As I said in the book, they think Chinese is synecdoche for Asian Americans, the way Kleenex is for tissue. I mean, people don't know about Asians. And I was just so sick of how Asians still had no control over their own stories that I was like, I need to write a book that basically cuts through the bull and for that, you know. And I'm, if you know my poetry at all, my poetry is very experimental. Like I like to play with diction, and you could also accuse me of being a kind of a postmodern poet or whatever. But like, although even though race was always very much a part of my writing, I just thought, okay, this is a challenge for me, but I have to really write as directly and clearly as possible. And I think, like Matt, a lot of that also had to do with the fact that I became a mother. I had a child, and I was like, what is my daughter going to be like when she turns 18? What's this country going to be like? How is she going to be perceived? What's her identity going to be? So these are just questions that I had that I want answered. And I think the way I, as a reader, approach nonfiction versus fiction and poetry is that I go to nonfiction for answers. And usually what I come away with is an answer. In poetry, I either I go there sometimes to find a different kind of truth for escape. Maybe for poetry and fiction, I go to fiction and poetry more clearly or in a different way. But this time I had a lot of questions that I needed answered that other books were not addressing. And so I felt the need to write that book myself, so.
Just to, since, you're a poet, like, so Robert Frost says something about poetry that I think really can just apply to any genre of writing. Robert Frost said that, like, poetry is a way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget. And, I think this just applies to any of us who are writers and who read. And so, like, I'm curious, like, what do you think that your work is particularly concerned with, like, memorializing or remembering or documenting?
Me?
For both of you, yeah.
I could start. Oh God, so much, I mean, because I just feel like I'm part of a racial group that's been erased and forgotten, and being a woman, being a Gen Xer. No, I'm just kidding about that. But there's like stats of polls are like baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z. I'm like, where's the Gen X? Come on. This is so absurd, like, but it's also very Gen X that Gen X would be forgotten. But anyway, I would say there's just, for me, like every book that I write, every poem, every prose, it's always about the history of violence. There's always history and violence, or what history is forgotten. And that is, everything about like where my parents came from, where I come from, Korea, is just so much of that history is so esoteric and so little known in this country, even though the US had such a huge involvement in its destruction, in its in the murder of the civilians of Korea, and just being an Asian woman is to be just completely forgotten. And so I think that's, usually that's what I'm memorializing. I'm memorializing that forgotten history. I'm memorializing and trying to reckon and women of color, Asian American women, Korean American women, Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha as an example in my book, who was raped and murdered, and that which wasn't talked about. I mean, there's so much. I feel like there's so much that we have to memorialize. I don't even know where to start. And, I'm like, even when I'm writing about, like, say, South Korea, which is a small country obscure country that people don't really know much about. I'm like, it's universal. It's like everyone should know about this, because the history of trans-capitalism, neo-imperialism, war, all of that has affected, non-whites all over this world. And there is that connection because of that. So it's a good question, and I could give you a different answer every hour. Matt, how about you?
I think for me specifically, I'm trying to, the Korean adoption wave of which I'm a part was this kind of huge boom, and now it's kind of flattened because Korean adoptees themselves have, done the activism to try to change the laws in Korea, and so sometimes I feel like we're like a generation that's trying really hard, like to go extinct, and so I think of myself, if I'm memorializing something, then keeping some kind of record of what it's like to be this, and to think like this is the first really huge wave of transracial transnational adoption, um, that still is still going on, and but it's kind of moved to different countries, or I think a lot about the people within that Korean American adoptee community who are mostly kind of around my age, a little older sometimes, and slightly younger sometimes, but all kind of aging out of existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are such important stories that I'm so grateful for, that you're there telling it. And Nicole, and I have poets like Todd, who are also who are writing about it as well. Yeah.
So let's see. Okay, this may or may not be a fun game, but the last news thing I saw right before I joined this call was that in Florida, the sheriff has now banned both deputies and any visitors to the sheriff's office from wearing masks. So, describe America in 3 words and tell us why. What 3 words did you pick? Describe the America we live in now. I feel like, Cathy, your face says it all, though.
Not that different. That's what I would say.
Crass. I'm just thinking shitstorm clown.
You got to add a couple words though.
Shitstorm clown. That's what I thought of.
I feel like we're at the height of absurdity and surreal right now. So just like, how do you write when language is almost incapable of describing the absurdity that you're in? Like, we've watched people like literally hold picket signs against biology because they don't believe in COVID. So watching people like protest the virus is just like,
this is
what's happening
for some time. I mean, like when Trump got elected in 2016, people like writers and artists were freaking out, and they're like, this is the end of the world. How are we going to write? I was freaking out. Like, I was like, I don't even know how I could continue with this book. Like everything right seems so like irrelevant or small compared to the hurricane that is our history. I'm going to use a different natural disaster metaphor this time. But I think that, but you just do it. You just have to and whether it's going to, and you can't forbid yourself from, say you're writing a memoir about your mother having cancer, and you're like, oh, I can't write about this because it's too personal, it's not political. And it's like, no, you should still do it. That's where you feel the compulsion to do. You should feel the compulsion, whatever's happening around you will filter into your writing, and the tone and the rhythm, or in the voice somehow. And or if you can also feel this compulsion to write about the pandemic. And I know I've seen people say, or heard people say, oh, it's going to be so annoying to read all the pandemic stories that are going to come out. And maybe I was like a little eye rolling about that, but if you feel the compulsion to do that, like I have a student who like I was teaching a grad poetry where my students were just shell shocked, and they're like, I don't even know how I could write poems right now. Just like, it's not going to happen. And they ended up writing really fantastic urgent poems. And I had this one poet who was like, refuse to touch the P word, you know, I'm not going to, or the C word. I'm not going to write about coronavirus. And
Those could be very different things, but
yeah,
very different words.
it was a tour de force. It was amazing. And it's just like, it's like, you just have to trust your intuition. Your intuition is smarter than, you know, your critic who's like, I can't write anything, or, you can't write about that. And you just write through it as if it's any other time in history, and it will come out and it'll be incredible. You know, people have written through all wars, disasters, and so forth. I think what's also important is that
Uh-oh.
oh, hi,
Hi, there you are.
or something happened to my computer. Anyway, that's what I was going to say. Oh, I was just going to quickly say that it's important to just write everything down, and then you could always shape it later.
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
I feel like no matter what Trump does, he's always got Andrew Jackson there, right? Like he can always be like, there was this worst guy. You know, this my students will come in too and say like, this is the worst time in history. Like, you know, like this country had slaves, right?
Yeah.
It's not like this is the peak of absurdism, or I mean, this country has been super absurd for a long time.
Yeah.
And
from its inception, its
you
foundation.
know,
Yeah, it's the premise of this country
No.
is a kind of absurd. Yeah.
right, exactly. So I don't know. I guess think right, all those things are still there, and sometimes if things are going well, right, which they kind of did for a little while, we think, oh, this is the real country that we live in. And then when it like the real country that we live in pops its head up, we're like, where'd you come from?
Yeah.
You know,
Get ready for
not that
November.
surprising. Yeah.
Oh God, I know. Don't say that yet. We have to wait until November.
I know.
I know.
But like, you know, Cathy, I think you bring up a good point. I always hear people say that, like, especially now that like, oh, I don't want to read anything about the pandemic. And like on the face, like I understand it's like kind of like those Leaving New York essays that like people get tired of. But like in an unprecedented time in history that we're all experiencing vastly different, we don't want anyone documenting this, especially like how else will we record what has happened to us brown people, you know, if we don't do this, you know? Like, so to me, it also feels like, you know, extremely necessary that all of us as writers are paying attention to whatever is in our hearts to pay attention to, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like, you know, kind of like in that line of thought, you know, in light of paying attention, luckily writers just tend to be really obsessive people, so we always have some weird obsession. So I wonder, what are yours right now? Do you two have anything that you're like just like in a rabbit hole in right now?
I'm playing a lot of Pokemon. I actually think this is
So that's your next
pretty
book?
good life. You could just live a whole life playing Pokemon. I've seen now on YouTube that it's actually possible, and I'm never going back. I've done writing books.
Is this Pokemon? My daughter just brought some Pokemon cards home, and I'm like, where'd you get that?
I never got into it before. I just, you know, I was a teenager when the cartoon came out. I felt like maybe I was a little too old for it or something.
Yeah.
And the games always, I guess I felt I'm a little too old for all the games too. But now with kids, it's like, what can I have my kid play? And so we tried the newest Pokemon game, and now I'm just, I don't know, I can't stop thinking about those cute little creatures.
I think it's a different, yeah, I just think it's a different language. Wait, so is it Pokemon that is obsession just in our life or in our writing?
In anything, like in your life, if like there's like a weird thing outside that you can't stop obsessing about, tell us about that too.
Oh yeah. Oh, by the way, I'll tell you, but like before when I was talking about people don't want to hear about the pandemic, I think it's less like the protests that are happening and like, but more like it's more the white person's ennui of staying
Oh, yes.
outside all the time and baking banana bread and listening to Fiona Apple. I think it's more that stream.
Yeah. Oh, I know what we mean, but a lot of white people are saying this, and I'm like, you don't need to write a story, but the rest of us.
Yeah,
do.
no, but like the rest is, that's the thing. It's like, we don't need to hear like you reassessing your life while you're baking banana bread. I think that's the coronavirus story that people don't need
Yeah.
to hear.
Like the Second Home New York story that came out.
Oh
So
God, no.
the worst thing ever.
It's basically clickbait, yeah.
Yeah. So I think before, time is speeding by. So I think before we go to a couple audience questions, Matt, would you like to give us a closing reading? And thank you both. This was fantastic.
Sure, I'll just read some doppelganger facts here. So just 2 paragraphs. In nature, doppelgangers exist because of evolution. Edible grapes evolved to look like poisonous fox grapes. King snakes evolved to look like poisonous coral snakes. Their safety is in the appearance of a deadly other. On the other hand, it is wrong to talk about evolution as if a species can choose its path. The real reason for its change are predators. A snake resembling a coral snake survives because its predators fear to eat it. Under those terms of survival, 2 different species sometimes evolve to look the same in 2 different places, like 2 butterfly species, both with spots resembling owl eyes. In either location, predators mistake those spots for owls, and so those butterflies survive to have sex and birth butterflies whose spots even more resemble owl eyes, and so on and so forth, until separate species appear the same because their survival has appeared the same. Scientists call this cryptic biodiversity. Doppelganger species can look so similar that only DNA testing can tell them apart. I found all of this on the internet as soon as I got home. In human history, the internet suggested, doppelgangers often foretell death. Soon after his first election, President Lincoln saw 2 reflections of himself in a single mirror. He described one self as a little paler than the other. The First Lady described it as a bad omen that her husband wouldn't live through a second term. English poet Percy B. Shelley saw his doppelganger point out to sea not long before Shelley died on a sailing trip. English poet John Donne saw his pregnant wife's doppelganger holding an infant at the same instant his live wife suffered a stillbirth many miles away. Before her death, Queen Elizabeth I saw her doppelganger inert on her royal bed. In Scottish legend, fairy creatures give birth to sickly babies that look the same as human babies, and thereafter, they try to swap out their kid for yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. All right, so we've got a couple of questions. So, Matt, first question for you. So, did the novel change much from its first draft to the published version? Yeah, so you edited this book with Vivian Lee. So, like, talk us through, like, how did this, like, transpire?
The novel's so different. I can't seem to write a novel that doesn't take, almost a decade to complete and go through like totally different drafts. So this book started, as I said, it started as a murder mystery. It was called The Murder of the Doppelganger. I started with that title. I thought this will be a cool book, The Murder of the Doppelganger. And to write it, I did this thing where I did the George Costanza method, and that's what I was thinking of it. Right, like there's an episode where he does everything exactly the way he wouldn't do it, and everything goes well for him. So I was like, I'll just do this, right? Like I'm a terrible writer, so if I do everything exactly the wrong way, then it will all be great. But the problem was what I had for a first draft was really just like a bunch of things like blanking out, disappearing into thin air. And then later when I didn't know what to do with that, they would reappear again. And then sometimes they would disappear again. And so I just ended up with this very strange manuscript. I was also trying to write like a video game version of a novel where the characters kind of leveled up as they went and had boss battles and so on. So there were like various boss battles going The book now, I mean, there are kind of threads of that, right? And the largest thread is the disappearance, which I think took a lot of trying to figure out what disappearance meant to me, and like why it would keep showing up in the work, and why I thought that was unexpected. So that's kind of how I figured out what the book was about. The Costanza method, exactly, yeah. So it's vastly different, vastly different. I also think what I did in like years of editing toward the end was try to get puns into every single sentence, and I could have kept doing that forever. And I kind of, like, what appeals to me is the Walt Whitman method, right? Where you just write the same book over and over for your entire life. One book, that seems so great, right? I could do that with this book, just trying to get every single line to have a joke in it.
I love it. Oh, see, she says she loves the Costanza method, or they love the Costanza method, so that's great. All right, Cathy, this next question's from you, also from CE Shu. I love both your memoir and poetry. How does the use of poetic forms affect the material you write about?
That's a good question. For poetry, I think that I think of the content first before I think about the structure. I kind of just like write images or just stories, and then I'm kind of a slut when it comes to poetic forms. I like to use all different kinds of forms, and then I guess I think about, like, a lot of it comes down to music. You know, I really, music for both prose and poetry is really, really important to me. And I just think about, for me, before anything, it's about getting sort of the rhythm down for a poem. And then when I get the rhythm down, then I think of what the structure is appropriate for it, whether it's going to be in a lyric form, or whether it's going to be a sonnet or a long narrative poem and so forth. For prose, I would say what I learned from poetry was absolutely instrumental. With Minor Feelings, the writing first started as poems. First started as poems, and then they weren't working as poems because I wanted to write about race and the Asian American condition in a really direct way, and it wasn't working with poetry, so I turned to prose. And for me, it was really important to kind of, but I preserved a lot of the kind of poetic lines, and also just the way I organized the nonfiction too. Is almost like I was treating the paragraphs as stanzas, as prose poems, you know, that I would sort of rearrange rather than having this kind of linear argument. That was really important to me, to have that sort of associative thread running throughout rather than something that was like a lot more logical.
And then this last question is for both of you. This is from Ashley Duffy. Any advice on how to incorporate life, writing / the personal in a discipline that's not welcoming to personal subjectivities, positionalities? I'm a PhD student in art history and a Korean adoptee, which shapes my work, but seems to confuse or annoy or stump my mentors.
Yeah, personal is political. That's why they don't want it in there, right? Like, if the personal's political. I think you've gotta, maybe sometimes it can be really hard to do this, but to like look for mentorship outside, who's for somebody who can tell you, right, like, you have to kind of fight these battles within the system because nobody's going to fight them for you there, which is hard. I think it's really hard. It's hard to write academic work that really invests in the politicalness of the I, but it's also really important, I think, especially if you want, especially if you want people to read it. I think sometimes the thing about academic work is that, like, sometimes it can take all of the personal out of it in a way that makes it so very contained within its genre or area of study.
Yeah, as a non-academic, I shouldn't say this, but it just academic writing needs a complete and total overhaul. And I think actually a lot of academics have said that writers who are actually it's writers or academics agree. It's just like, why are academics still stuck on this like really dense jargon, critical approach to their subject matter? There's really, why can't it be personal? I guess it's like to maintain some level of objectivity, and it's, I don't know, it's a shame, but I agree with Matt. I think you need to find maybe mentors outside your department, like go, you won't be, I guess it depends on the kind of university you're in, but I don't think you'll find it from the art history department. You might be able to find mentors, if not professors, then at least other writers or somewhere in the English department, I don't know, in the writing department or somewhere else where you could do it. And there are definitely, actually, they tend to do it after they get tenure. I've noticed this where academics will get tenure and they'll be like, all right, I'm free. I'm going to write my weird hybrid personal book. And unfortunately, it's so rigid, right? Academia is so rigid where you have to write in a certain way. But I think there are academics who do that, like, Maggie Nelson got her PhD. She, and she wrote The Argonauts and Bluets. But then there's also others like Saidiya Hartman wrote, her last book was very and beautiful. And so I'm seeing, there are definitely more and more academics who are writing in that way. And I'm hoping it's more, I'm hoping that you don't have to have tenure in order to do it, that you can do it when you're still a PhD student. Screw it, just do it.
Yeah.
Do it, just do
And
it.
I just want to echo that. I feel like as people of color, especially when you're coming up in these institutions, the hardest thing to talk yourself out of first is to not call people who don't support our histories our mentors, So I'd say find a different word for those people. They're not your mentors. To Cathy's point, looking in creative places where you can find those people, maybe even outside of academia, because lots of people like art that aren't in those institutions too, and can probably, just show you a lot of just interesting ways that come in at something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Stanza method.
I mean, sorry, because right, you're in the academic system and you have to prove some kind of worth within that system, while also trying to change it to, kind of acknowledge your own kind of truth. It's difficult. I think it's difficult.
Absolutely. All right. So I think that is all. Wait, hold on. That's all the questions. So thank you both again for joining us, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us to celebrate the launch of Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear. It is available through Powerhouse, and I'm pretty sure Powerhouse also has Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong. So be sure to check both of those out, and don't forget to go to the Amazon page and give them both 5-star reviews.
Cathy's books are so good. You should check them out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This is excellent. Thank you so much to Matthew and Cathy and Hafizah, and to everybody who asked questions. If you missed any of the event for any reason, we'll have it on YouTube soon. And please buy the books if you haven't already. The link on the event page and then on the chat. And every book helps us put on more great free events. And it also helps out the authors. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Congrats, Matt.
everyone.
Buy the book.
Bye.
Bye.